Welcome to the CareerMetis Podcast. I'm your host, Nisar Ahmed. This is episode 58 of the CareerMetis Podcast, and this episode is part of the Career Expert series, where in each of these episodes, I have conducted interviews with career experts, career professionals who have experience helping job seekers, helping individuals to navigate their career with the job search, etc. So, for today, I'll be speaking with Pete Blum. Just a quick introduction. I'm actually excited about this particular interview. It's a different format than most of the other career expert series because Pete runs something called the VeteranConnections.us podcast. Sorry, I think it's called the Veteran Connections. It's a weekly podcast that supports our transitioning veterans as they begin their journey into the civilian business world. Pete interviews veteran business owners about what steps they are taking, the hurdles they have encountered, and what advice they can offer other veterans and business owners as well. And I think this is a little timely. Today is June 3rd when I'm recording this. Just last week, a few days ago, we had Memorial Day in the US, so I thought this would be a very timely topic to cover. And Pete would be sharing his experiences in talking to both business owners who hire veterans and also to veterans as well who are looking to get into the business world. So, hey, Pete, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I think this is going to be great, and we're going to have a lot of fun and share a lot of knowledge with everyone.
Great to hear. The first question I always ask my guests before we begin is, where are you calling from?
I'm based out of Tampa, Florida, actually a little town just north of there. And so sunny Florida, enjoying the weather and enjoying life.
Can you share with us an interesting fact about Tampa that people usually do not know unless they have lived there?
Well, when it comes to interesting facts, there's just all kinds of cool stuff and things to see in Florida. But I guess one of the things that people may not know about that's here is there's a place just north of where I'm at called Weeki Wachee. And that's the thing that you may have seen on TV sometime in your life, but there's basically more or less real life mermaids. There's ladies that dress like mermaids, and they go in the water, and they've trained to hold their breath for a long time so they don't have dive tanks or anything, and they go down in the water and do performances, and you can watch them through glass as they perform as mermaids, and that's really crazy. So,
wow, I did not know that such thing happened. That's amazing. I'm definitely going to check that out. Holding your breath underwater for a long time, that itself is a humongous feat, and now they're doing it as a performance. That is pretty interesting. So I wanted to dive into the interview, and I'd like to learn a little bit more about yourself and also how you started the Veteran Connections podcast as well, and how and why exactly. What led you there?
Sure. Basically, right out of high school, I actually graduated when I was 17, so a little early compared to everybody else because I didn't take study hall classes. And I decided to join the military, and I spent 11 years in the military. Actually was in the Navy first, and then I went and got out of there and joined the Marines, and I was in the Marines until I got out of the military. So that's kind of where the whole military thing comes in. But where it ties into transition is really, when I got out of the military, I decided, I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio originally, and I said, I'm not going to live anywhere where it snows. So once I got out of the military, I moved to Florida, never been here before. I just knew I wanted to live where there was, sand and beaches and stuff like that. So I came down to Florida, took a while to find the right job, but I was in a particular job that I really liked for about 15 years. And then, even though I had transitioned out of the military successfully and found a nice job in the civilian community, one of the things that happens in the world today is companies are trying to save money. So basically, the company that I was at for so long, they decided they wanted to outsource. And at the same time, they decided they wanted to go to the cloud. So they didn't need as much equipment, they didn't need as much people, and they ended up laying off about 150 people. And since I was one of the senior people in my department, I was one of the people let go. So that put me right back into transition again. So being someone from the military who had transitioned once successfully, I now had to start the whole process over. And I started this trial of, looking and trying to find a job and joining groups that could help, job support groups, online groups. And I was able to successfully, get into another job again that I'm at today, and I really love it. And it gives me great opportunities to do things. But through that process, I realized, all these people that are getting out of the military, they're going to have to face trying to join companies, trying to find the right fit of a company. And they might have to deal with the same things that I did, like, outsourcing or going to the cloud or things like that. So I wanted to help them with their transition. And that kind of led to the start of the Veteran Connections podcast.
At the beginning of the interview, I did provide a high-level description of the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit more about the podcast, what someone can expect to hear?
Yeah, sure. Basically, when I started doing it, it was actually just a series. Me and my boss have another podcast. It's the Florida GovCon podcast, and it's about government contracting. And we were doing series. A lot of podcasters do series. 7 episodes on one thing, 7 episodes on another thing. So my boss does government contracting, but for my side of the house, since I'm the IT guy and I'm the veteran and I don't really know a whole lot about government contracting, I was doing things with business, like how a business could use Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn to help improve their business and move forward. And then when it was time for me to do another series, I was like, well, can we do something to help veterans? So that's where it started. And it was just a 7-episode series. And what I did was I interviewed basically veteran business owners, someone who had transitioned, they had gotten out, they had started their own business. And it's really interesting because every one of them tells a different story about what happens when they get out. Some of them might have been easy or hard. Some of them might have started a regular job first and started a business later. Some might have jumped straight into a business. So there's a lot of knowledge and experience that can be brought out of all the different ways that people did things and things that people can learn about, financing or partners or whatever. And that ended up being so popular that my boss was like, we should just break it off and make it its own podcast. And that's what we did. So that's where I'm at today. Okay.
So I want to ask you a question because the premise of your podcast and what you help is, you mentioned that when they make a transition from being in the Army or Navy into the civilian world or into the business world, I'm just curious, compared to someone who's not been a veteran, what do you think are some of the unique challenges they face?
Well, one of the biggest things I think that most military people deal with is a lot of them go in young. So if you got somebody that's going in the military at 17, 18, even 20 years old, if they spend a whole career in the military, 20 years, 25, 30 years, when they get out, they've done that their whole life. So they don't really know anything about the civilian community, and things on the outside are very different from the military. In the military, if you think about it, whatever job you have to do, you basically are given a set of orders, and you follow the orders and you complete the mission and you get that job done. Mm-hmm. On the outside, in the civilian community, there's always lots of things going on with like meetings and talking and ideas, and it's not really always direct orders. So sometimes I see that when people come out, there's like a lack of direction, or just they're not used to the style of doing it. Or if they're a senior military person that's gotten out after 20 years and they want to get into a company, they're used to giving orders. People in the civilian world aren't used to that. So there could be a little, discomfort there. So it's a lot about the transition in how you act and what's expected of how people, feel in the real world, because it's a lot more sensitive, basically. Things are more strict and regimented in the military. Mm-hmm. And then you get out into a world where you got to, be friendly and kind and ask people to do things, please.
Interesting. That's actually very interesting. And I've not thought about that. And I think most people know that life in the military is regimented, but I've never thought about it this way. In terms of making a transition, this would be a challenge. My understanding was it would be actually a benefit for businesses to have someone who's disciplined. This, which brings me to the next question. If there's a business out there, what are some of the benefits they get by hiring someone who has spent, let's say, 5, 10, 20 years in the military that they may not find when hiring someone who has not been?
Well, there's actually a lot of benefits to hiring a veteran, but one thing that you got to say right off the bat is there are things that companies get, like points or benefits from hiring certain different types of people, like, veterans, women, minorities, that all counts towards something for a company that qualifies them for different things. So that right there off the top, it gives them basically points towards something. But about the individual themselves, a lot of times in the civilian world, I mean, how it is, people at different jobs, you go there, you show up, you're getting a paycheck, you punch out at 5 o'clock, you go home. A lot of people, they're okay, I'm in, I'm out, I'm getting a paycheck, I'm happy. In the military, the people that come out of the military, it's more of a mission. It's more of, you got to have a sense of accomplishment. And military people are more like, they show up on time. I'm going to stay there till I get the job done. They're very driven, very dependable, very honest. It's just there's a whole lot of qualities that you spend your whole life developing, and that is something that I think any civilian company would love to have, that high and intense dependability, and someone that's going to strive for the company's success.
Very interesting. Yeah, that is. Like, I've interviewed experts. I've also spoken to companies that hire, and that's something that they always look for, right? Someone who is goal driven and someone is driven, self-motivated. So these are like amazing qualities for a potential employer. So the next question is, okay, now you talked about some of the challenges someone from the veteran would face. What are your recommendations? You talk to business owners, you talk to the job seekers as well. What would you recommend some of the things that they can do to help them with the process of finding a job?
To help a veteran find a job, you mean?
Yes.
You actually spend a lot of time working on that, because that's another thing. When a veteran gets out of the military, all military personnel are supposed to go through a TAPS class, which is basically a transition class. And in that class, they're supposed to teach you all kinds of things you need to know about getting out, who to call, who to contact, just different things. And they talk about jobs and how to find a job, and like they might talk about like you can use LinkedIn to try and find a job, and they might talk about that for maybe 20 or 30 minutes. But really, everyone that I've ever talked to who's been through TAPS basically says it's not enough. And the people who have gotten out of the military years ago, they probably laugh at that, because back then they had nothing. They got out and they were just on their own, see you later, kick to the curb. But these days there's programs in place to try and help people that are getting out. And there's also a lot of nonprofits that are out there, in the civilian world that also want to help the veterans that are getting out. But I think typically what someone would do is, if they're going to be getting out, you think, well, how am I going to find a job? A lot of people will start applying online. They'll do searches. They'll search for something they want. They go to that website. They apply. And what I help teach, at the LinkedIn class is that doesn't work at all. Because what it really does is it puts you really in a stack of maybe 300 resumes of people who have submitted things online. There's not a person involved in that process, because when you submit something online, I'd say 99.9% of the time that's going through an applicant tracking system, which is basically all the resumes feed into the program. And then the only time the resume ever gets looked at is if a recruiter on the other end of that program types in a word and you happen to have that on your resume. Then your resume pops up, then they look at it, then maybe they call you. But again, if they're dealing with a stack of 300 people, what are the odds? Not very good. So that's what a lot of people run into. They get disappointed, they get depressed, and people come out of the military that are going from one type of an environment to something completely different. That's a struggle. So we spend a lot of time saying, hey, if you want to find a job, first of all, you want to research companies. And then really the best thing to do is if you find a company that you really like, try and find a veteran in that company. Because if you find someone who's just like you in the company, you know you're going to get the straight scoop about the company. Mm-hmm. And that person's really going to want to help you to also get into that company. We talk about joining groups. I've been in job support groups where you actually go there personally, but it's very convenient also to just join groups online. And I usually tell people to use LinkedIn for that, because if you're really getting out and you're serious about getting a job, LinkedIn's the number one, business network in the world, basically. So that's a place to go really to find things and to get a job. And they also have jobs right there on LinkedIn. So I teach a class every month with a nonprofit called Project Transition USA. And that's what we do. We spend a whole full day teaching them how to, when you get out, here are the steps that you can take. Create a really good LinkedIn profile. You want to have good branding. You want to get all your information on there so it looks great. We teach them how to join groups so they can do searches and find what it is they're looking for. How to make connections and introductions and all that kind of stuff. And then they can actually, talk to someone, maybe instead of a resume that just gets in a pile somewhere. Now they have a person they can talk to. They can walk that resume personally over to a hiring manager or a recruiter and say, hey, this guy is who you need to hire. And that's really the way to get it done.
So an amazing takeaway from what you just mentioned, Pete, is do your research. And if you find someone like you, it just increases your odds. You compare to your competition who's applying just like everyone else. And you're competing with 300 people, but if you can find a common connection, that's where networking comes into place, right?
Right. And the other thing about that is it's not just finding a person in the company, but you want to hit it from two sides. If a veteran's getting out, he can find a veteran in a company, and now he's got basically a brother or a sister who's willing to help him out. Mm-hmm. But on the other side of that is when you're researching, like LinkedIn is a good example. Again, if you're researching on LinkedIn and you find you're looking for companies and you go to a company page and you like that company page, now you can see what's going on and you can follow that company. And what that does is if you're interested in working there, one, the company's going to know that you like their page and that you're interested. Two, if you're looking at their company page, you can see what's going on with them, what kind of events, what new things they're up to. So now when you walk into an interview to talk to someone from that company, you know about the company. Because the one thing that companies hate the most is when somebody applies, they get in the door and they don't know a thing about the company or the company's culture. And they're sitting down and it's just like, okay, so, well, everything's uncomfortable. Well, if you can walk into an interview and you've done research because you've been watching their company page and you can say, oh, I saw you guys just, had an event for whatever. So you break the ice. Everything's really comfortable. It's really smooth. It's a great way to start off an interview. It just takes a little research.
That's actually another great tip that you just dropped in there. Look out the company's LinkedIn page, and that is something I haven't heard before. It's great advice on this podcast, because you're right. When you look at a company's LinkedIn page, it has a little bit of all the professional highlights of the company, the new hires, what they've accomplished, and those are things you can talk about in an interview. So that's an amazing trip. So just to recap, find someone in the company and also find a little bit more about the company. Not just going to the website, go to the LinkedIn page as well. So that's a great, solid advice right there. So I want to move along in this process. So they have looked at the company, they learned something about the company, they found someone in, and let's say they've secured an interview. What do you recommend in your experience would be some of the tips, some of the ways to stand out in an interview?
Standing out in an interview. Well, see, the interview is one of the most complicated things, really, because, you can get in the door, but it comes down to when you sit down, how you come across to those people. And I could say that, especially for military people, there's some things that they have to look out for when they go into an interview, but really these things may apply to anyone. But I would say that, we already talked about the breaking the ice thing. And obviously, everyone knows that you need to dress professionally when you go to an interview. But when there are certain topics that might come up, they go through questions, because interviews these days, they usually have a couple parts. There's a part that has to do with technical skills, or there might be a part that is behavioral, because they want to see if you're a fit for that company, and they ask you some interesting questions there. So it really depends on which kind of interview it is that you're in at the time. But for military people getting out, one thing that I've heard over and over again is that there's a couple things that they do that's wrong. And if people know these things that are wrong and they avoid them, they have a much better chance. The first one is that they say team too much or we too much, because you go into an interview and they want to know about you. They want to know what skills you have, what have you actually accomplished yourself. But the military is so team-oriented. You do everything together. And in the military, it's not I, because, then you're just, that nobody likes you. Everything's about the team in the military. So you have to actually train yourself, teach yourself to be able to talk about yourself when you're getting out of the military, so that you can say that, I accomplished this, or I met this goal, or I saved this much money. And then now they know that, okay, this guy's really good. This guy did something. Otherwise, when you leave, they're going to have a feeling that, well, he said we so much that we can't even figure out exactly what it is that he did. What did he do? What did his team do? We don't know. So now you're not really maybe going to get that job. Another thing is that when you go into an interview, people from the military, something that they face is they're so used to the structure and more or less, I guess, the strictness and the orders, that when they're into a company now who isn't like that at all, sometimes the interviewers can get a little intimidated, because a military person might walk in there and be like, oh yeah, I got this job. I can do this. I can do that. I can do your job. They just have that confidence. They have that, I can do anything, and no matter what you throw at me, I've got it. And that really comes across bad in an interview. They'll be like, wow, I'm trying to talk to this guy, hire this guy, and he wants my job already. So people from the military, when they get out and they start doing things like that, they need to actually tone it down, because what you want to do is you want to fit the culture of that company. And that's another good reason to do that research, because that you can find out before you go in there what their culture is. What do they like? How relaxed are they? You can see pictures of, the teams hanging out, the workspace, things like that. So yeah, you don't want to come across wrong in the interview. And then, of course, there's just, hundreds of other questions that people throw at you that are behavioral. They ask you about money. That's always an uncomfortable one. I've always said for the money question, because that's a big one that throws people, is that they say, well, how much do you want to make, or something like that? Well, the answer, back to them could be, what's your range? Because rather than you throwing out a number that they're like, well, that's not going to work, if you ask them what their range is, then now they have to give you some information, and then you can kind of figure out something in that area where you think you fit based on your skills. A lot of times, another thing that people could say is that, because you don't want it to be all about money, even though money is important, but you don't want an interview to come across like that is the most important thing, because you want them to feel like you're coming to that company to help them, to solve problems, to do things that they need. So you could always say that, when they ask, well, what do you want to make? You could always say something like, well, I think that your company would make it sure that it was fair based on my skills, and try and avoid the question. Have that for a later conversation. They may come around and turn around and try and ask you the same thing again. And, that's where you could ask them, what their range is. But it's really a subject to try to avoid if possible, and not make it about money in the interview, and make it about what you could do for that company.
Interesting. I think that applies to most job seekers, and that's a question that throws a lot of people off, especially because if they don't practice the money question. And I think you gave great advice there. Is instead of answering a number or throwing down a number, ask them what's their range and what works within their budget. That helps them. That actually throws it back to them. So it actually makes it a less uncomfortable for you, makes it a level playing field for both the interviewer and the candidate. So that's good. I want to go back to two of the points you mentioned. I'm really curious because my understanding with most interviews, most companies, they want, even though someone is an individual contributor, they want someone with a team spirit. And what you said is, someone in the military, they used to working in a team, they find it difficult. So don't you think that would be a more of a positive than a negative when they can talk about what they have accomplished as a team? I'm just curious because I never thought about it this way.
Well, it is good to be a team player. And yes, companies do want team players. And it's okay to talk about, we accomplished this or we accomplished that. And companies will ask things that maybe are team related, like how well do you work in a team might be a specific question that they ask. And, you could say something about, we did a deployment and we did this and all of our team, meshed together to make this mission happen. But that's an answer to a specific question about how you fit in a team environment. The problem comes is when they ask other questions where they're looking for your independent skills and you're still saying we. So it really just depends on the particular question. Mm-hmm. If they're asking about a team player sort of thing, then you give them a scenario about something that you guys all did together. But you got to really pay attention to those other questions where they're asking for your specific skills, not to get yourself, out of the job because you keep saying we the whole entire time.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that because that's something I wanted to expand on. So thank you. So now let's walk through this journey, right? So they have applied for a job, they got the interview, and now they even negotiated a good salary. They've got the job. And what would you recommend someone, let's say they got the job, what type of career path advice would you give them? What can they do? What are some of the things they can do to expand their career after they've secured employment?
Well, I think all that stems from the research really before you get the job, because if what your goals are is to stay with a company for a long time, you probably don't want to stay in one particular position the entire time. You might like to grow, maybe get a promotion, maybe be a manager someday, something like that. And you can find out by talking to people before you get the job, what a career path might be like for that company. Do they promote within? That's actually a question that you can ask in an interview is, what would my career path be, again, before you get hired? So these are kind of some of the things that you want to flesh out beforehand, because a lot of times this is actually very common. People will get a job because they need money, and then they're only there for a couple years. And it doesn't really matter if you're coming out of the military or if you're a civilian that's getting out of college or out of high school. That happens all the time, all across the board. People need a job, they need money, they get a job. It's just something that they do temporarily, because it might not be an exact fit. So really, to answer that question, it's like if you are getting out and transitioning and wanting to be there a long time, it goes back to the research again. You find out about the company. Is it a cultural fit for you? Do you believe in the same things that they believe in? They might believe in a lot of, volunteer type work, helping the community, helping, feed a country or homeless or something. So that shows you their culture and what they believe in. You just need to find something that matches how you feel or that matches your passion. And then that once you're in that company and you've already found out your career path, you can kind of know how things are going to happen with you, through that process. Because once you're already in the company, if it's not a fit, you'll just really be gone in a couple of years, because if they're a certain way, if that company is a certain way and, you didn't do the research, and you can just be like, okay, well, I'm going to hit a dead end at some point, and you'll be out there looking all over again.
Interesting. So it's this reminds me of a quote by Stephen Covey, who says in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, begin with the end in mind. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of job seekers make, is they find a job, but they don't necessarily give much thought into their what happens next. And that's where your advice comes into picture is, do your research, find out if it's a good cultural fit, see if you can see yourself working there a long time, So, that's actually very important, because what if you get the job and a few months later you're dissatisfied?
Exactly. I mean, there's do they have everything that you want? Are you a fit? Do they have the benefits that you need? There's just think about all those things first, so that you know you're going to be happy.
Okay, fair enough. So I think we are coming to the end of the interview here, Pete. Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you any last words. Are there any specific advices that you would give to the listeners here that we haven't covered so far?
I would say, we've talked about, how to get into a interview, and, we've talked a little bit about an interview, but I would just say the interview being the critical point where they make a decision because you're there in front of them, whether they like you or not. There are plenty of good videos that are out there on the internet on like mock interviews where you can watch them and see how people do. What mistakes they make. In mock interviews, a lot of times they'll make mistakes on purpose so that you can see what it is that someone does wrong, and then they'll show you the correct way to do it. So I would say watch some videos about interviewing, and that would be a great tool to make sure that you succeed when you get to that point.
That is good advice, because to be honest, I've done that many years ago. Whenever I'm in a position where I have to look for a job, or even a salary negotiation, I look at the interviews, and it's actually one thing to read about it. Like I write on my blog, me and other writers write career advice. But if you watch, it gives you a better understanding. So that's good advice as well. So Pete, thanks for joining the podcast, sharing your journey, sharing your top tips. I learned a few things which I mentioned and talked during the interview. So it was a pleasure.
Yeah, it's really great. I like to be able to help people, and I think that us working together, we can definitely help more people. So that's awesome.
Yeah, thanks for that as well. Definitely, it's all about helping others. If after listening to an interview like this, even if one person finds a job, I think you and I have accomplished what we set out to accomplish. So that's a good way to put it. Thanks, folks, for listening to this episode of the CareerMetis Podcast. I have written a brief summary of the interview and also links to Pete's podcast as well. If you liked what you heard, feel free to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and now even on SoundCloud, and very soon coming to YouTube as well. If you enjoyed this episode, learned something new, feel free to post a comment or a review. And if you really loved it, definitely go ahead and share it among your network. Until next time, this is Nisar Ahmed, your host for the CareerMetis Podcast. Thank you.